week 5 of the fantasy football season, and his wide receiver starts it this week. The first start's Ja'Marr Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. I know Ja'Marr Chase, the numbers haven't been great so far this season, where he was going even second overall in some fantasy drafts this year. So right now, the last 2 games, he's gotten a little bit better. Obviously going for 141 yards in week 3 versus the Rams. And then last week's game, 73 yards in garbage time at the Tennessee Titans. But I think this week here, after all the rumblings and Chase not happy post-game in that week 4 loss at the Titans getting blown out, he said he's open and he wants to get him the ball. So right now with a good matchup at the Arizona Cardinals that have no Budda Baker in the secondary. He's injured and out for a few more weeks here. I think Chase and this Bengal offense could get right a little bit in this one. And he's a wide receiver I still have confidence in. And to start this week, the next start's Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. As Garrett Wilson, he got peppered with targets in week 4's ball game versus the Chiefs in a tough loss with 14 targets. So we know Wilson's one of the better wide receivers in the league. We know Zach Wilson's one of the worst quarterbacks in the league, and that's been the problem with Garrett Wilson this season, not putting up consistent numbers. But this week with a good matchup versus the Denver Broncos, over the last 2 weeks, they've given up 98 points. Is this defense here? I know Patrick Surtain's one of the premium corners in the league, but he's even getting burned up a little bit in that secondary. So right now, after last week, figuring out a little bit here is Garrett Wilson and Zach Wilson. And now versus a defense that gives up the most fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. I have Garrett Wilson as the start. Next start's DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. So DJ Moore's been pretty much the only bright spot for this 0-4 bad team this season, where he's got 2 ball games over 100 yards this season and 3 games with a touchdown. So right now, good matchup versus a Washington secondary that isn't all that great. But we've seen Hollywood Brown have a decent game this season versus them. We saw last week A.J. Brown torch them for over 35 fantasy points in PPR leagues. And I think DJ Moore, him and Fields have a good rapport. He could run all the routes. He could work underneath as well in yard after catches more. And Fields definitely trusts him, and that's why they went out there and traded away one of their high picks to get DJ Moore and another pick in the deal. So this week here with a good matchup versus the Commanders on Thursday Night Football, which is obviously usually a high-scoring ball game where there's more points on the board usually. He's a start this week. The next start's Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers. So I know Deebo Samuel's obviously not 100% with the rib injury, and we saw it in week 3's ball game on Thursday night. But Deebo Samuel, he still could go out there and make plays. I know he was limited in week 4. We only had 3 carries, 6 yards, and didn't catch the football at all. But this week here, it's a big game in week 5 versus the Dallas Cowboys. A couple of the top teams in the NFC most likely this season. Obviously with Philadelphia ahead of Dallas as well. So Samuel's got a great track record versus the Dallas Cowboys. A few years ago in the playoffs, he put on a huge performance and they beat him in Jerry's World to eliminate the Cowboys. And this week, Sunday Night Football, this is going to be a monster ball game between these 2 NFC teams. And I think Deebo Samuel has a good one. He didn't play much, like I said, in the last week's game. He's healing up a little bit from the ribs, and now they're going to need him in this one because it's going to be a close ball game, I believe. I think San Francisco will win, but anyway, I think Deebo Samuel is going to make a few crucial plays in the ball game. The next start's Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. So Jalen Waddle, it's definitely been a struggle for him this season in the early going. The first couple weeks, he only had 11 and then 12 fantasy points. Then week 3, missed the ball game with a concussion. And then week 4, he didn't do much, only 8.5 fantasy points. And it was garbage time where the game was out of hand, losing 48-20. But this week, a great matchup versus the New York Giants that are top 10 and giving up fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. So this secondary has a lot of youngsters in it, a few rookies as well. And I think Jalen Waddle, this could be the breakout game for him after the first few weeks with the injury and not putting up numbers at all. That this kid could go out there and put in a good game, because last season he had over 1,300 yards receiving. So right now I think Waddle's going to find it. He's going to get things going, and this could be the biggest game for him this season possibly. And he's a start. Next start's Adam Thielen of the Carolina Panthers. So Thielen last season, he pretty much looked like his best seasons were behind him. But right now, being the number 1 option in this young Panther offense with quarterback Bryce Young, he's gone out there and he's had 15 or more fantasy points the last 3 weeks in a row for this Panther team and fantasy owners. So right now, a good matchup at Detroit, where I think they're going to be trailing early and often, is Thielen and this Carolina Panther team. And we know he's very familiar with the Detroit Lions defense, where they versed Detroit twice this year with Thielen for many seasons when he was with the Minnesota Vikings. So this week here with game script and a ball game, they'll be trailing here as this Carolina Panther team and have no choice but to throw a lot I think Thielen once again has a good ball game, and I definitely could see him possibly get over that 15-point mark once again in the final start of the week's Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. Scary Terry, he's had a couple good games this season. Nothing eye-popping like a breakout game, but this week here, Thursday Night Football, Chicago Bears versus this Washington Commander team. And like I said early in the video, those Thursday night games are usually high scoring for the most part. So this Bear team can't stop anyone on defense. They're top 5 in giving up fantasy points to wide receivers. And like I said, Scary Terry is a solid number 2-3 wide receiver for most fantasy owners. So this week here with a good matchup, and him and Sam Howell each and every week starting to get things going and more on the same page. He's a start this week. Now to the sits, Jerry Jeudy of the Denver Broncos. So Jerry Jeudy, he gets a lot of hype each and every season here, but I just don't think he's a guy you can really count on. He's a consistent week in and week out starter for your fantasy roster. So this week here with a tough matchup versus the New York Jets, one of the better secondaries in all pro football, with second-year corner Sauce Gardner most likely going to be on Sutton or Jerry Jeudy in this ball game, and Russell Wilson not really playing that efficient of football here. I think Jeudy, once again, he's not going to put up many fantasy points, and I have him as a sit. The next sit's Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So Christian Kirk, I know the last 3 weeks now, he's starting to kick it into gear, getting a lot of targets and putting up fantasy points on the board. But right now, a couple factors for me. Buffalo's a good defense, number one. Even though I know White's out for the season, they're feared he tore his Achilles. I know Poyer, he's been banged up as well. But another thing, Trevor Lawrence, he just hasn't been accurate this season, and he's not making plays really for Christian Kirk and this team. And Zay Jones possibly returning. So right now, with those few factors factored in, a tougher matchup, Trevor Lawrence not playing great football, and Zay Jones most likely coming back in this one, I believe here. Christian Kirk is a wide receiver that most people probably still would play with the bye weeks this week, obviously, but he's a guy that I think has a bad ball game. And I would sit him next to Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. I know London's coming off a touchdown in his last ball game, but how could you really trust anyone in this passing game anymore for this Falcon team? Kyle Pitts, he's been a non-factor in the passing game. I know Jonnu Smith somehow had over 80 yards in their last game for this Falcon team, but Drake London has been touchdown dependent. The Houston secondary is pretty decent so far in the early going. And right now, Drake London, like I said, I know coming into the season, he was a 6th, 7th rounder at latest for fantasy owners, but right now he's not putting up numbers, and he's been touchdown dependent. So right now, I don't know if he's going to score a touchdown in this ball game, and he's not really a wide receiver I would trust this week, and I would sit him next to Jacoby Myers of the Las Vegas Raiders. So Myers, so far this year, he's had a couple decent ball games. Week 1, he had over 25 fantasy points. Week 2, he sat out with the concussion. Week 3, he had 15 fantasy points in that one versus Steelers. And then last week in Week 4, we just didn't see much from him in that one with the rookie quarterback O'Donnell versus the Los Angeles Chargers. So right now, this week here, not a horrible matchup versus the Green Bay Packers, but I don't know if O'Donnell's going to start, or Jimmy Garoppolo, who obviously had a concussion and missed Week 4's ball game. So right now, Jacoby Myers, number 2 wide receiver over there behind Devontae Adams for this Vegas Raider team. Monday Night Football, tougher matchup versus the Packers, who should get a little bit healthier in the secondary with Jair Alexander coming back. So right now, Jacoby Myers definitely a decent receiver, no doubt about it. But this week here, I think he takes another step back after coming off of 2 catches, 33 yards. And he could score probably 8-10 fantasy points, but I don't see him being much of a factor for fantasy owners. The next hit's Tank Dell of the Houston Texans. So Tank Dell, I know he's a talented wide receiver. I know he's got breakaway speed and game-breaking ability in the receiving game. But last week, we didn't see much out of Dell. And I think that these patterns are going to be for this Houston Texan team. Nico Collins will have a big game, and Dell won't do something in that game that Collins goes off. And then Dell will have a big game, and Collins won't have numbers. That's just what we've seen so far the first 4 games of the season. But C.J. Stroud, for me, he's the real deal. He's a quarterback that could get the ball to his wide receivers, and he's not turning the football over, and that's another key point. But right now in a matchup with the Falcons, I give up the 5th least amount of fantasy points to wide receivers on the season, and still with Nico Collins and Robert Woods ahead of Dell on the depth chart, I think this week here in a pretty tough matchup, he's a wide receiver I would sit. But like I said, he's got game-breaking ability where it wouldn't be surprising to me if he has something like 3 catches, 80 yards and a touchdown as well. The next hit's Michael Thomas of the New Orleans Saints. And so far, Michael Thomas, he's been serviceable for fantasy owners. But right now, it looks like his ceiling in PPR leagues has been 10, 12 fantasy points here for Michael Thomas. We know Chris Olave is the true number one wideout over there for this same team. I know that Ricard, he's definitely not 100% with his shoulder injury. And this week here, pretty tough matchup at the New England Patriots. I know they got the doors blown off by the Dallas Cowboys 38-3. But in that one, no one really had a monster game. I know CeeDee Lamb had a touchdown, but it was more the Cowboys defense making plays. So I think the secondary is still solid here in New England, even though we know Gonzalez, one of their main corners, he's out with injury, and Michael Thomas, at this point of his career, he's a fringe 3 flex option. And this week here at the New England Patriots, I don't think he's going to do much in this one as Thomas. And I have him as a sit, and the final sit this week, Sky Moore of the Kansas City Chiefs. So Sky Moore, a lot of people thought it was going to be the breakout year here for Moore with this Kansas City Chiefs team, but that just hasn't been the case. I know week 2 we had a decent game versus the Jacksonville Jaguars, but the last few weeks here we haven't seen much. I know he's got a good matchup on paper here versus the Minnesota Vikings, one of the worst secondaries in the league, but I just can't trust him. I know his quarterback's obviously Patrick Mahomes, and he can make any wide receiver for the most part look good, but right now Sky Moore hasn't looked good in this offense. Kadarius Toney hasn't looked good, and Rashee Rice, we really haven't seen much out of him, and Valdez-Scantling. So right now there's really no wide receiver on this Chief team I could trust, and obviously Sky Moore has been getting a lot of attention this season going into drafts, and even now in fantasy leagues. He's not a wide receiver I would start or have confidence in this week's wide receiver start sit here for week 5 of the fantasy football season.